When my parents decided to move, it wasn't because we wanted a fresh start. It was because we had no choice. My father had been laid off from his job, and despite his best efforts, we were barely scraping by on my mother's salary and whatever my sister could earn from part-time jobs. We needed something cheaper, something out of the way, where the cost of living wasn't as punishing as it was in the city. That's when my mother found the house. The realtor had painted a picture of tranquility, a beautiful, old home with lush green surroundings, plenty of space, and just one neighbor, an old man named Joseph, who acted as a kind of caretaker for the area. At first, it seemed perfect. The house had history, with its tall windows and ivy-covered walls, the sort of place you'd expect to find in a painting. The land stretched out for acres, and for a while, the peace and quiet felt like exactly what we needed. There were no neighbors except for Joseph, who lived in a small cabin at the far edge of the property. He was an old, grizzled man with deep lines in his face and eyes that seemed to see more than they should. My mother was wary of him from the beginning, though she never said it out loud. But soon, the house began to change. It was small things at first. The pictures on the walls would tilt, as if disturbed by an unseen hand. We'd hear faint creaks in the floorboards late at night, but the house was old, so we didn't think much of it. The occasional flutter of bats in the middle of the day, or the odd whiff of something foul in the air, didn't raise too many alarms at first. But then things began to escalate. Doors would swing open by themselves, even when they were locked. The television would flicker on and off, its screen showing brief, distorted images that would disappear before we could make sense of them. Objects would go missing. First little things like keys or books, but then larger items like furniture would move without explanation. My mother was the first to say something. "There's something wrong here," she whispered one night, her voice low as if she didn't want the house to hear her. "I can feel it." My father didn't believe her. He chalked it all up to stress, the strain of losing his job and the burden of starting over in a new place. He spent most of his time locked in his makeshift office, trying to piece together freelance work, while the rest of us dealt with the strangeness of the house. But when bruises and strange marks started appearing on his body, dark, round shapes that he couldn't explain, he finally started to pay attention. We didn't know much about Joseph, other than that he'd lived on the property for as long as anyone could remember. He kept to himself, rarely venturing out unless it was to tend to the land around his cabin. The house sat at the edge of a thick forest, and Joseph seemed to treat it as his personal domain, patrolling the woods like a ranger watching over something ancient and dangerous. One afternoon, while my sister and I were playing soccer in the yard, the ball sailed over the fence and into Joseph's territory. My sister dared me to retrieve it, and not wanting to look like a coward, I climbed over the fence. The moment I stepped into his yard, the air felt different, heavy, almost suffocating. The grass underfoot was damp, even though it hadn't rained in days, and the shadows cast by the trees seemed to stretch longer than they should have. I found the ball lying near a cluster of stones that looked unervingly like headstones. As I turned to climb back over the fence, I felt something grab my ankle. My heart leapt into my throat, and I kicked frantically, only to realize that it was Joseph, his gnarled hand gripping me tightly. "Kid," he growled, his voice rough and low, "tell your parents to leave. Tell them to find a new home before it's too late." I stared at him, wide-eyed and terrified. His face was lined with age, but his eyes were sharp, gleaming with a kind of fear that I hadn't expected. He wasn't threatening me, he was warning me. I scrambled back over the fence, clutching the soccer ball to my chest as I ran back to the house. My mother saw the fear in my eyes as soon as I burst through the door. "Joseph," I gasped. "He said we have to leave. He said we need to get out before it's too late." My mother's face went pale, and she wasted no time. She stormed over to Joseph's cabin, intent on confronting him, demanding answers. But she returned not long after, her face white as a sheet, her hands shaking. "We're leaving," she said, her voice trembling. "Pack your things. We're getting out of here." We packed in a frenzy, throwing clothes into suitcases and stuffing belongings into bags. My father was skeptical, but when my mother told him what Joseph had said, his face darkened. He didn't argue. He just nodded and began to help pack. As we hurried to gather our things, my mother told us what Joseph had revealed. The house we were living in hadn't always been a home. Long before it was built, the land had been used as a burial ground, an old, forgotten cemetery where the dead were left to rest without proper rites. The graves had been disturbed when the house was constructed, and the spirits that had once been at peace were now restless. "They don't want us here," my mother whispered. "They don't want anyone here." According to Joseph, the house had been abandoned by every family that had ever lived in it. No one stayed longer than a few months before they were driven out by the strange occurrences, the whispers in the walls, the unseen hands that seemed to push and pull at the living. Worse still, Joseph said that the spirits weren't just angry, they were growing stronger. Each time the house was occupied, the disturbances became more violent, more dangerous. And if we stayed, there was no telling what might happen. We packed as quickly as we could, but as night fell, the house seemed to resist our attempts to escape. The doors, which had always swung open on their own, were now jammed shut. The windows rattled in their frames, as if something was pounding on them from the outside. The air grew thick, like we were breathing through water, and the temperature dropped so suddenly that our breath turned to mist. My mother was frantic, yanking at the front door, but it wouldn't budge. My father ran upstairs to find another way out, but I could hear him shouting in frustration as every window refused to open. It was as if the house had decided we weren't going anywhere. And then the whispers started. At first, they were faint, like the rustle of wind through the trees. But as the minutes passed, they grew louder, more insistent. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew they were speaking to us, warning us, taunting us. My sister grabbed my hand, her face pale with terror, and we huddled together in the center of the living room. The lights flickered, then went out completely, plunging the house into darkness. My mother was sobbing now, pounding on the door as if she could break it down with sheer willpower. My father rushed back down the stairs, his face grim. "We can't stay here," he said, his voice barely audible over the growing cacophony of whispers. "We have to find another way out." But there was no other way. As we huddled together in the living room, the whispers seemed to close in on us, surrounding us from all sides. It felt like the house itself was alive, breathing, watching. But then, through the darkness, we saw something, a figure, barely visible, standing in the doorway. It was Joseph. He was covered in mud, his clothes torn and ragged, his eyes wide with terror. But there was something else, something off about him. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and there was a wildness in his eyes that made my stomach turn. "They're here," he whispered, his voice trembling. "The dead, they want blood." My father stepped forward, trying to reason with him, but Joseph shook his head violently. "I tried to warn you," he said, his voice growing louder, more frantic. "I told you to leave. But now it's too late." He turned and pointed to the windows, where dark shapes seemed to writhe and twist just beyond the glass. "They're angry. The spirits. They want to take you." My mother screamed, and Joseph suddenly lunged forward, grabbing my father by the collar. "You need to give them something," Joseph shouted, his eyes wild. "A sacrifice. Blood for peace. It's the only way." My father shoved him off, his face filled with a mixture of fear and disbelief. "You're insane," he spat. "We're not sacrificing anyone." But Joseph just laughed, a high-pitched, maniacal sound that echoed through the room. "It's not me," he whispered, his voice filled with madness. "It's them. They want you." The whispers had grown into a chorus, their voices rising and falling like a twisted chant. Joseph was pacing the room now, muttering under his breath, his eyes darting around as if he could see something we couldn't. "We need to get out," my father said, his voice shaking. "We need to." But before he could finish, the ground beneath us trembled, and the floorboards creaked ominously. Something was moving beneath the house, something alive. "They're coming," Joseph whispered. "They're coming for you." And then, with a deafening crack, the floor split open, revealing a gaping hole beneath the house. From the darkness, we saw them, figures, pale and ghostly, their faces twisted in rage and despair. They were the spirits of the dead, the ones whose graves had been disturbed, and they were reaching for us. My father grabbed a chair and swung it at the nearest figure, but his efforts were futile. The spirits were everywhere, surrounding us, their cold hands grasping at our clothes, our skin. My sister screamed, and I felt a hand close around my ankle, pulling me toward the hole. "We have to do something," I shouted, my voice barely audible over the noise. Joseph stepped forward, his eyes filled with a dark, terrible knowledge. "You have to give them what they want," he said, his voice steady now. "You have to offer them a life." My mother, still clutching me tightly, looked at Joseph with horror. "No," she whispered. "We can't." But Joseph's eyes were cold, devoid of any humanity. "It's the only way," he said. "A life for a life. A blood sacrifice." My father stood frozen, torn between disbelief and fear. But the spirits were growing stronger, their grip tightening. We were running out of time. Then, without warning, Joseph lunged forward, his hand outstretched toward my sister. It happened so fast that I barely had time to react. Joseph's gnarled hand closed around my sister's wrist, yanking her toward the open pit where the spirits writhed and moaned. My mother screamed, pulling her back, but the spirits were relentless. "Let her go!" I shouted, rushing toward them, but I was too late. The ground beneath us buckled, and I was thrown to the floor, the air knocked from my lungs. Joseph's eyes gleamed with a manic intensity as he dragged my sister toward the pit, muttering something under his breath, an ancient chant I couldn't understand. The spirits surged forward, their skeletal hands reaching out for her, desperate to claim the sacrifice. But then, something changed. The whispers faltered, their voices growing quieter. The spirits hesitated, their movements slowing as if they were uncertain. Joseph stopped, his grip on my sister loosening. I could feel it, the house was waiting. It wasn't satisfied yet. Suddenly, a voice cut through the darkness. It was deep, resonant, and filled with an otherworldly authority. "Stop!" The spirits recoiled, their hands retreating into the shadows. Joseph froze, his eyes wide with terror. My mother, still clutching my sister, looked around wildly, searching for the source of the voice. And then, from the shadows, stepped a figure, a man tall and imposing, with eyes that seemed to burn with an inner fire. He wasn't like the other spirit. There was something different about him, something more alive. "I am the keeper of this land," he said, his voice calm but commanding. "And you have trespassed on sacred ground." Joseph collapsed to his knees, trembling in fear. "Please," he whispered. "I've done everything you asked. I've kept them away. The figure silenced him with a wave of his hand. "You have disturbed the balance," the figure said, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "This land was never meant to be disturbed. The dead demand justice." He turned his gaze to my family, his eyes narrowing. "But you," he said softly, "are innocent." The spirits moaned in protest, their hands twitching toward us, but the figure raised his hand again, and they fell silent. "There will be no blood sacrifice," the figure said. "But you must leave this place. Now." Without another word, the figure turned and disappeared into the shadows, taking the spirits with him. The whispers faded, the house falling into an eerie silence. For a moment, none of us moved. We were too stunned, too terrified to react. But then my father broke the silence. "Get up," he said, his voice hoarse. "We're leaving." We scrambled to our feet, grabbing what little we could carry. My mother pulled my sister close, tears streaming down her face as we raced for the door. This time, it opened easily, the heavy oak swinging wide as if the house itself was letting us go. We didn't look back as we ran to the car, the night air cold and biting. Joseph stayed behind, still kneeling on the floor, his eyes wide and empty. He didn't try to stop us. As we sped away from the house, the weight of what had happened began to sink in. We had come so close, too close, to losing everything. Years passed. I grew up, left home, and tried my best to forget about the horrors that had nearly destroyed my family. But some memories don't fade with time. They linger, just out of reach, waiting for the right moment to resurface. And no matter how hard I tried to bury what happened at that cursed house, the feeling that it would come back for me never truly left. I moved away to college, got a degree, and started working as a software developer in a bustling city far from the quiet, haunted countryside of my childhood. Life had settled into a comfortable routine, though I always felt like I was one wrong step away from falling back into that nightmare. It was around the time I turned 30 that things began to shift. At first, it was small, subtle things, just like when we first moved into the old house with my parents all those years ago. I would wake up in the middle of the night, certain that I'd heard whispers. Objects in my apartment would go missing, only to turn up in odd places later. Doors that I knew I had closed were left wide open when I returned from work. I told myself it was stress. Work was busy, my relationship with my girlfriend, Emma, had become strained, and I chalked it all up to the pressures of adult life. But as the weeks went by, the strange occurrences escalated. One night, I came home late after a long day at the office. The lights in my apartment flickered as soon as I walked through the door. I stared at them, dread creeping up my spine, but after a moment, the flickering stopped. I shook it off and headed to the kitchen to grab a beer. But as I opened the fridge, something caught my eye. A figure, standing in the hallway. I froze. My heart slammed against my ribcage, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. The figure was barely visible, just a shadow, really, but it was standing there, watching me. It disappeared before I could fully comprehend what I was seeing, but the air in the apartment had shifted. It felt heavy, oppressive, like something unseen was pressing down on me. I slammed the fridge shut and backed out of the kitchen, my eyes darting around the apartment. I heard a faint noise, something like whispering, coming from the bedroom. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew what it was. The sound was eerily familiar. The house hadn't let go of me after all. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself that I was overreacting. But the whispers grew louder, the presence more pronounced. I'd feel cold drafts in rooms with closed windows. The smell of damp earth, the same scent from that night at the house, would seep into my apartment. Then Emma started noticing things. "I swear I closed the bathroom door," she said one morning, her brow furrowed in confusion. "And didn't we just put the picture frame back on the wall yesterday?" I didn't want to scare her. I didn't want to explain what was happening, because I didn't understand it myself. But I couldn't deny it anymore. The same thing that had plagued my family all those years ago was happening again, and this time, I didn't have anyone to run to for help. The breaking point came one night when Emma woke me up, shaking my shoulder frantically. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. "There's someone in the apartment," she whispered. I bolted upright, my heart pounding in my chest. "What? Where?" She pointed to the doorway, her hand trembling. "I saw him. A man, standing right there." I jumped out of bed, ready to confront whoever it was, but when I turned on the light, the hallway was empty. No sign of an intruder. But the air felt colder, unnaturally so. And then I heard it again. The whispering. I couldn't keep the secret from Emma any longer. I told her everything, the haunted house, Joseph, the spirits, and the sacrifice that never happened. She listened, her face shifting from confusion to fear to disbelief. But she didn't laugh, didn't tell me I was crazy. Instead, she nodded slowly and asked me what we were going to do. "I don't know," I admitted. "But this, whatever this is, it started when I was a kid. It's connected to that house. I didn't want to go back. I swore I never would. But there was no other option. I needed answers, and the only place to get them was at that house." We packed a few things and drove through the night, heading back to the countryside where my childhood nightmare had begun. The road leading to the old house was just as I remembered it, dark, winding, and surrounded by thick, oppressive trees. When we finally arrived, my heart sank. The house was still standing, though it looked worse for wear. The paint had peeled away, leaving the wood underneath exposed to the element. The windows were dirty, cracked in some places, and the once beautiful green lawn had turned into a patch of overgrown weeds and dead grass. But the most unsettling part? Joseph's cabin was gone. Burned to the ground, with nothing but charred ruins left behind. I felt a chill run down my spine. What had happened here? Emma squeezed my hand, her eyes wide as she looked around the decaying property. "Are you sure about this?" she whispered. I wasn't sure of anything, but we had come too far to turn back now. We walked up to the front door, but before I could knock, the door creaked open on its own. The inside of the house was dark, the air thick with dust and decay. But as we stepped over the threshold, it became clear that we weren't alone. A man stood in the living room, his back to us. He was tall, with broad shoulders and hair as white as snow. He didn't turn around when we entered, didn't seem to acknowledge us at all. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. The man finally turned. His face was pale, his eyes sunken deep into his skull. But it was his expression that sent a shiver down my spine. He was smiling. A wide, twisted smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You've come back," he said, his voice calm but laced with something darker. "I've been waiting." I swallowed hard, trying to keep my fear in check. "Who are you?" The man tilted his head, studying me with an almost predatory gaze. "I'm the keeper now," he said. "Joseph is long gone. He couldn't handle the responsibility." "What responsibility?" Emma asked, her voice tight with fear. The man's smile widened, revealing yellowed teeth. "To keep the dead at bay. To keep them satisfied." I took a step back, pulling Emma with me. "We're not staying. We just came for answers." The man's expression darkened. "There are no answers here. Only what you left behind. The spirits. They haven't forgotten you." Suddenly, the temperature in the room plummeted. The air became thick, and a familiar sense of dread filled my chest. The whispers started again, louder this time, coming from every direction. "They've been waiting," the man said, his voice soft but filled with malice. "They're not done with you." Emma grabbed my arm, her grip tight. "We need to leave. Now." But before we could move, the floorboards creaked, and shadows began to crawl across the walls, twisting and writhing like dark tendrils. The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they became a deafening roar. And then I saw them. The spirits. They emerged from the shadows, pale, translucent figures with hollow eyes and twisted mouths. They moved slowly, their skeletal hands reaching out toward us. The house felt alive, the walls closing in around us, trapping us inside. "We have to go," Emma screamed, pulling me toward the door. But the man, the new keeper, blocked our path. His smile was gone, replaced by a look of cold, malicious satisfaction. "You can't leave," he said softly. "Not until they're satisfied." I could feel the icy touch of the spirits closing in, their whispers swirling around me like a storm. My heart raced, and for a moment I thought we were doomed. But then I remembered something Joseph had said all those years ago. A sacrifice. They wanted blood. They wanted someone to pay the price. "Emma," I whispered, my voice trembling. "We need to distract him. We need to get out of here." She nodded, her eyes wide with fear but filled with determination. Together, we lunged at the man, knocking him off balance. He stumbled back, his eyes blazing with anger as he tried to regain his footing. The spirits surged forward, their hands reaching for him now, as if they had been waiting for this moment. The man screamed, his voice filled with terror as the spirits dragged him down into the darkness. "They're coming for you," he shrieked, his voice fading as the shadows consumed him. "You can't escape." But we didn't stop to listen. We bolted for the door, bursting out into the cold night air, the screams of the man still echoing behind us. We didn't stop running until we reached the car, gasping for breath and trembling with fear. I turned to look back at the house, half expecting to see the spirits chasing after us, but the house stood silent, its dark windows staring back at us like empty eyes. We drove through the night, not stopping until we were miles away from that cursed place. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't truly escaped. That the house, the spirits, and the new keeper were still out there, waiting for us to return. But I had learned something in that moment of terror. There was a way to break the cycle. The spirits didn't want to claim the living. They wanted justice. They wanted what was owed to them. And so I made a vow. I would find a way to give them what they wanted. I would uncover the truth behind the land, the bodies buried beneath it, and I would finally put them to rest. The house hadn't let go of me yet. But this time, I wasn't running.